So I've been loving making these iceberg videos as of late, and I've also been reading a lot of short stories. I really love short stories, and I think they're kind of an underappreciated medium. So I wanted to make an iceberg video about creepy short stories since those videos are doing pretty well right now, for my channel at least. So today I'm going to be covering the creepy slash disturbing short stories iceberg created by myself. I couldn't really find an iceberg image for this one, and so I just decided to make it myself like I did with my creepy children's book iceberg. If you haven't seen any of my iceberg videos before, then first off, welcome to the channel. With these videos, I try to go into a lot more detail than the average iceberg video. I find it more interesting personally to hear about the topics on the iceberg in kind of a more in-depth way, an in-depth setting. That does mean that there will be spoilers for a lot of these short stories. They are short stories, so if you hear one that sounds interesting and you want to read it, then it shouldn't take you very long to read the whole thing, and most of them you can find online for free. There won't be spoilers for every short story though, and I will give you a verbal warning before getting into spoilers for a specific story. Unlike my disturbing books iceberg videos, I have actually read all of these short stories, so I feel like I can talk about them with some more authority than like the disturbing books iceberg video. When I was making this iceberg, I kind of tried to order these books in 6 levels, starting with kind of the tamest and getting to what I find to be the most intense or horrifying or disturbing stories. Obviously, you may have different feelings about which ones are more disturbing, but this is kind of the way that I felt they kind of ranked on the ladder, but they are kind of like mixed up a little bit in the middle. Also, a lot of these short stories are going to be coming from the same authors. There's like a couple by Stephen King and a few by Shirley Jackson. It was just kind of easier to find collections of the specific author's short stories. If this video does well and it gets, a good amount of views, then I'll probably make a part 2 with like new authors and more short stories, but you can again expect a lot of like Stephen King and Shirley Jackson in this video. If you haven't subscribed yet, then please do. I make content about horror literature and creepy books and all sorts of other creepy and non-creepy things that I'm interested in. I'm trying to get to 10,000 subs at the end of April, and I just crossed 8,000 subs, so I'm getting pretty close. Thank you guys, as always, for your continued support on these videos. It has been kind of just beyond anything that I ever expected. I'm just so grateful for everything that you do to help me make this channel grow. But that's enough yapping for me. Let's get into the disturbing short stories iceberg created by myself. Let's do this thing. Level 1. The Masque of the Red Death is a short story by Edgar Allan Poe that is probably my favorite short story of his. He has a couple great short stories, but this one has always been kind of eerie and mysterious to me. Something about it just really creeps me out. It is the story of a wealthy prince named Prospero who throws a massive masquerade ball with a bunch of wealthy nobles. They plan to hide out in the prince's abbey due to the threat of this plague that is sweeping the nation that's simply called the Red Death. The idea is that the prince and the wealthy nobles will enjoy their opulent lives together in this abbey while the common folk are left to deal with the effects of the disease. The abbey contains 7 rooms, each decorated with a different color, and the guests are invited to make their way through each room as the party progresses. Things get a little weird when a guest shows up as kind of dressed as the embodiment of the Red Death, which is obviously a bit of a mood killer since they're all trying to avoid it. I won't spoil the story for you. It's pretty short and it's a really fun read, and it's also kind of notable for not really having a consensus on what the story actually means. Some critics just straight up reject the idea that this story is any sort of allegory, and they see it as kind of just a piece of fiction that's meant to be enjoyed and scare the reader. There are definitely a lot of different ways that you could interpret the story, and I have my own ideas, but Poe never explained why he wrote it. Beyond Lies the Wub is a science fiction story by Phillip K. Dick about a crew of a spaceship that comes into contact with a large talking pig creature called a wub. They spend most of the story deciding what to do with the creature, and there will be full spoilers ahead, so be warned. As the crew of the ship begins to leave port, one of the men, Peterson, hauls a massive pig onto the ship. The others ask him what it is, and he says that the locals call it a wub. The crew then takes the massive wub onto the ship and asks the chef to get ready to cook the wub. As the crew is talking about cooking the wub and how to prepare it for a meal, it suddenly starts to speak. It talks very properly and tells them that it would not like to be eaten, and it says that it is a race of beings that are very smart and may even possess supernatural mental powers. After a while, the rest of the crew comes around to the idea of sparing the wub, but the captain just insists that they cook it and eat it. The wub then asks to speak to the captain in private, and the two of them start their discussion in the captain's quarters. The wub says that it's unfair that he should be eaten, and he says they should draw straws to determine which of the crew should be eaten instead. The captain is admittedly amazed by the animal's ability to speak, but he still insists that they need food, and to spare the wub would just be a poor decision. He goes to leave the room, and the captain kind of freezes suddenly. He's reaching for the door, and he stops all of a sudden, and then the wub just walks past him and heads down the hall. The wub then goes and talks with the other members of the crew about philosophy, and specifically the story of the Odyssey and Odysseus. The captain enters the room and points his gun at the wub. He tells the men that he's going to kill the creature, and they insist that they spare it since it's sentient. The captain is unable to be convinced by the rest of the crew, and the wub attempts to persuade him one last time, but the captain pulls the trigger and shoots the wub. Later, we see the captain eating the wub with the rest of the crew, and they all look sad and kind of refuse to eat the meat. The captain encourages them to partake in the feast and says that he's been held back from eating a wub for some time. It's a little odd since the captain didn't know what the wub was, and the story ends with the captain asking the crew to cheer up and to continue their discussion, and he then continues to say what the wub was saying about the Odyssey, and the crew looks at him dumbfounded. So from this we can deduce that the wub definitely used its abilities to mind control the captain and then like switch consciousness with him at one point, and then he kills himself as the wub and eats his own species, now living inside the body of the captain. This seems to be shown when the captain freezes when he's leaving after his discussion with the wub. He kind of stops moving, and the wub moves past him, and he comes in and tries to kill the wub. It really seems like that's kind of when this weird switch happens, but it's just kind of a weird story in general. This one isn't super graphic or anything, and it's mostly just kind of funny, but I thought it deserved a spot in the video just for being so different from most horror short stories that I've read in the past. The sci-fi angle is interesting, and I feel like it covers a lot of ground in its short length. I love the idea that the crew is hesitant to eat the wub because he is a sentient creature, but then the creature sees no issue in hijacking the body of the captain and then eating himself. It makes the ending just feel a little uneasy in my opinion. The wub has survived, but the crew now knows just how powerful this creature is, and they're totally at its mercy. The Yellow Wallpaper by Charlotte Perkins Stetson is a story that I covered in my first Disturbing Books Iceberg video. I think it was my first one, it could have been my second one, but I did get a major fact wrong when I was recording the video. I originally wrote in my script that the story was written in the late 1800s, but in the video I said it was from the late 1900s, which isn't true. This is a very old gothic horror story, and it's one that totally gives me the creeps. I wasn't required to read it in high school, but I know a lot of people were required to read it, and this would have seriously messed me up if I had read it in high school. It's that particular brand of like kind of quiet horror that really scares me the most. The story is about a woman who has been confined to a single room in her house shortly after giving birth. She's experiencing postpartum depression, and her husband, who is a physician, as well as her brother, who is another physician, have advised her to stay away from the baby to recover from this depression. This is literally the opposite of what you should do in these cases, but this is also what was actually done back in the day when we as a society just had less medical knowledge and less psychological knowledge. The woman is kept confined to her room and is understandably upset at this. The story follows her mental deterioration as she sinks further and further into madness due to her isolation. It's written just impeccably, and it makes her madness sound somewhat reasonable almost, kind of like she is convincing you that there is something kind of paranormal or creepy happening when it doesn't really seem like there is, but again, she's really convincing. This is another quick read that you can find online for free, so I'd seriously go check this out, especially if you like gothic horror and you're looking for something that kind of has a similar vibe to Shirley Jackson's writing, which we'll cover a little bit in a bit. It's a really good story. It's a Good Life is a short story by Jerome Bixby about a 3-year-old boy named Anthony Fremont that possesses near godlike powers. Due to this, all of the citizens of Peaksville, Ohio are completely at his mercy. It was actually turned into an episode of The Twilight Zone that is really, really good. It's probably one of the best episodes of that show. The little kid, Anthony, is definitely freaky, and this story has always kind of gotten to me from the first time I ever saw the episode of The Twilight Zone. That's the first time I experienced this story. We learned that the doctor that delivered Anthony tried to drop him and kill him since he could just tell the boy was destined for something awful. Due to this, Anthony actually killed the doctor at his birth and then separated the town of Peaksville, Ohio, where he was born, from the rest of the earth. The story is mostly just disturbing in that everyone knows that they have to do what Anthony says, or they will be turned into some like weird, twisted, horrifying creature, or be wished away into the cornfield. The cornfield is a place where Anthony sends things that nobody ever comes back from, and it's assumed by all the citizens of Peaksville to essentially just be the same thing as dying. The story has always creeped me out because the idea that such a young kid could be so powerful is really unsettling and just makes the situation very volatile and like unsteady. Young kids often throw temper tantrums for bizarre reasons, and they often can't be reasoned with at all. Anthony similarly cannot be reasoned with. He just treats any slight against him as an excuse to kill the person that offended him or wish him into the cornfield. This is made more dangerous because he can also read people's minds. This is definitely a story that everybody should check out. It's not graphic or anything. It's just a really solid read that explores a really interesting sci-fi concept through the lens of kind of this old American town. I really enjoy the story again. Easy recommendation from me. The Summer People is a masterful piece of literature from Shirley Jackson. This one is eerie in the way that it kind of like ratchets up the tension and makes the reader feel like an unwelcome guest in their own story that they're reading. There's nothing graphic or violent at all in the story. It just feels kind of off. The story follows the older and retired Allison couple. Mr. and Mrs. Allison stay at their lake home in the country during the summer, and then after that they leave back for New York City before Labor Day. They've been doing this for years, but this year they decide to stay on after Labor Day for a change. They don't really have anything waiting for them back in New York, and they're both retired, and they go to the grocery store in order to get some food to stock up, and they tell the owner that they're staying on after summer, and he says that nobody has stayed on past Labor Day before, and he just kind of looks uncomfortable. They make another stop at a store to get some supplies, and they tell the lady working there about their plans to stay on after Labor Day, and she says that nobody ever stays past Labor Day, and she hasn't heard of any of the summer people doing that before. As the story continues, we get the sense that the Allison couple don't quite fully respect the lives that the country people live. They seem to see this small town as kind of a novelty, and they talk about how they admire it, but it's written in a way that you can tell they're mostly amused by them rather than truly respectful towards them. It's kind of hard to express just through talking about it and not through reading it, but it's almost like they're like kind of talking in a patronizing way to the country people, like acting like their life is so simple, which I know is something that people who actually live in the country kind of get frustrated about. So it's an interesting kind of read because of that. Like they claim that they would be paying less in New York for their stuff, but that little personal touch of the workers just makes it all worth it. And money doesn't really seem to be any concern of them, which is obviously different from the people that live there. They go to the newspaper shop, and the owner, who is a relative newcomer to the town, tells them that he heard they're staying on, and he says that nobody has done that before. The Allisons return to their lakeside home, and they wait for the petrol man to arrive to give them fuel to heat their house and run their appliances. He arrives, but he tells them that he doesn't have any fuel because nobody ever stays past Labor Day, so he can't give them any. They ask about another family that lives across the lake, and they say that they stay on all year and obviously get the petrol delivered to them, so why can't the Allisons have it delivered to them? And he tells them that the other family across the lake is on vacation and won't be back for a while. He offers to give them some ice, but they refuse, and he drives away. It starts to rain, and the Allisons joke that it's probably good for the crops, again kind of making somewhat of a joke regarding the simple lives that the people of the town live. They call the grocery store and make a delivery order, but he says he can't deliver to them. Mrs. Allison presses him on this and again refers to the other family on the lake, the regulars that always stay on, and the owner of the grocery store says that they're out of town and that his delivery boy is going back to school, so they can't deliver to them. The Allisons start to grow frustrated, knowing they'll soon run out of petrol and out of fuel. And they also remark that their adult children haven't written to them in a while, which is also upsetting to them. Mr. Allison takes a grocery list and he gets in his car to drive into town the next morning, but the car won't start. He goes to check the mail and is ecstatic to find a letter from their son, and they read the letter, and the son tells them all about his job, and he gives a couple specifics about what he's doing, and the Allisons can't tell why, but they feel like something is off with the letter, and they notice many dirty fingerprints on it, which seems odd. They decide to call a mechanic in town to see about fixing their car, but they can't place the call. Their phone doesn't work, and a storm starts to kick up, and they look across the dark lake to see the lights on in the house of the family that's supposedly on vacation. They're clearly at their house. It's here that the Allisons come to terms with their string of bad luck. It's not really a realization, as they knew it all along, but it's more of an acknowledgement. They admit to themselves that the phone lines were cut, that the car was tampered with, and that the letter was forged and placed in their mailbox. They sit in their house that is now completely dark. The storm rages on outside, and inside, without food or fuel or power, the Allisons wait for what they surely know is coming for them. And that is where the story ends. I don't know if my summary did it justice, but this story is incredibly unnerving. The amount of times that the Allisons are reminded by the people that people don't stay past Labor Day is really unsettling. It really makes you feel like an unwelcome guest, as I said before. Given that Shirley Jackson wrote The Lottery, which we'll cover later in this video, I was waiting for there to be kind of a different kind of ending to this story, but we never really get what I was expecting. We know just as much as the Allisons do. The town has completely cut them off and lied to them and is potentially on their way to harm them. I really love the commentary on the Allisons not really respecting the lifestyle of those that live in the country. They kind of see their lives as like quaint or cute and like honest, but in a patronizing way. It always just feels super patronizing, to me at least. You can feel that the town really only tolerates them for the summer, and they're mad that they're staying on. Overall, I really loved reading this. It was suggested by one of my subscribers, and I really need to just sit down and read everything that Shirley Jackson has ever written, because she is a master at building suspenseful and uncomfortable situations. The Monkey's Paw is a short story by W.W. Jacobs about a family that comes into possession of a strange, cursed monkey's paw that can grant the owner 3 wishes, but each wish has terrible consequences attached to them. This is a really famous short story, and I covered it fully on my kids' Iceberg video, so if you're interested in hearing my full thoughts on it, then I would check it out over there. I really like this story. I read it for the first time in middle school, and I remember the ending kind of weirding me out at the time. The story is a fantastic example of not showing too much to the reader and letting the imagination of the reader picture something far more disturbing than the author could ever write. I don't always like when stuff is left up to the imagination, but it works really well in this story. It's also one of those things that's become kind of ingrained into pop culture. I feel like I hear the term monkey's paw often when somebody's talking about kind of getting something that you want, but it's not really great as they originally pictured. It has great consequences to it. So if you want to understand that reference, then give this story a read. It's really great. You can find it for free online. Level 2. The Human Chair by Edogawa Ranpo is one of the weirdest stories that I have ever read. It's about a chair maker that tries to become his own sort of human chair. It's really interesting, and the story is written really, really well, and it kept me engaged the entire way through. So full of spoilers ahead. If you think that premise sounds interesting, you can find this one online for free like a lot of these, but if not, I'm going to spoil the whole thing right now. The story starts from the perspective of Yoshiko, a famous and talented writer living in Japan with her wealthy husband who works for the government. Before she sits down to start writing for the day, she goes through all the mail that she has received. Most of the envelopes contain writing samples from aspiring writers that want to be noticed by Yoshiko, and she always reads every letter sent to her, starting with kind of the simpler, shorter ones, and working her way up to the more complex and lengthy ones. The last letter she reads for the day while seated in her chair is several pages long, and it reads more like a manuscript. The bulk of the rest of the story are just the contents of this letter, written by an unnamed chairmaker who describes himself as horribly ugly. The chairmaker starts out by explaining his terrible ugliness. He knows that no one could ever love him, and this makes him sad, of course. Despite this sadness, he takes great pride in his skills as an expert chairmaker. He makes chairs for the wealthy and then ships them all over the world. Before he ships a chair off to the buyer, he always sits on it, which is probably natural from a chairmaker. But when he is sitting, he imagines what the life of the person who bought the chair is like, and he kind of lives his life vicariously through these fantasies and mourns these lives that he never got to live. One day, he is tasked with making an ornate leather chair and ends up creating what could only be described as his masterwork. He sits on the chair and envisions the life of the king or politician that will sit on the chair, and again, he mourns that life that he will never live. He also grows a weird attachment to the chair itself, not really wanting to be away from it, but knows that he has to ship it off to whoever's going to buy it, and this makes him a little sad. But then he gets an idea. He says he will hollow out the chair and create a compartment for himself to stay in. That way, he can be transported to wherever the chair is going and not have to be away from it. So he collects some food and water and conceals himself inside the chair, and the chair is then delivered to a hotel. Over the next several weeks, the chairmaker lives in the chair during the day, letting the rich visitors to the hotel sit on him, essentially. He says that he can feel a connection with them, and then at one point, a woman sits on the chair and he falls in love with her. During the night, the chairmaker leaves the chair and steals various things from the hotel and is never caught because he can always just flee back to his weird little chair hole. Eventually, the hotel comes under new ownership and the chair is sold and put up for auction. And wanting to remain with his creation, the chairmaker stays inside the chair until it is eventually bought by a wealthy man. The chair is put in the house of this wealthy man, and the chairmaker is thrilled when he realizes that the chair is mostly used by the man's wife. And as the woman sits on the chair every day, the chairmaker falls more and more in love with her. He never says a word to her, but he feels her sitting on his lap essentially every day, only the thin layer of leather separating the two. The chairmaker wishes to make his feelings known to this woman, but is afraid of what she would say to the ugly man hiding in her chair. I'm going unscripted for a moment because as I'm reading this synopsis, I'm like, this is so uncomfortable, like so unbelievably freaky to be like, there is a man living in a chair, the idea of like somebody living somewhere where they shouldn't be, or like living in your house without you knowing them, is already horrifying to me. The idea that he's essentially living and sitting in this chair and letting people sit in his lap and he feels this weird, creepy connection to them, it's so freaky. But to make things that much worse, at the end of the letter, the author confesses that the chair that he is living in is, in fact, the chair that Yoshiko is currently sitting on. He was bought by her husband and has been quietly stalking this woman for weeks and living in her chair underneath her every single day. He asked her to place a handkerchief on the pot of flowers outside her window if she's willing to meet the man in the chair and run off and live a happy life with him. He says that he has collected enough of her personal possessions and stolen enough from the hotel guests that he has enough to sell and live a quietly wealthy life, and he only wishes that Yoshiko join him in his new life. Yoshiko understandably is terrified by this. She immediately gets up and feels all the blood rush from her face. The man living in the chair had written that he's not currently living in the chair, but is kind of just lurking around her house and waiting for her response. Yoshiko goes to alert someone when she is approached by her maid, who is carrying another letter that looks like the same one from the man in the chair. Yoshiko is horrified to see that it is in fact from the same man, the human chair, if you will. But this letter contains one last surprise for her. In the letter, the man apologizes and explains that he should have been more clear. His first letter was actually a creative writing exercise, and he was hoping that she could critique it. He knew that she had recently bought the leather chair and was simply just making the whole thing up, and he says he will call this story The Human Chair. So a pretty strange story, to be sure. Like I said, one of the weirdest things I've ever read, but I personally wonder if the second letter was just a cover and he actually is living inside the chair. It could be that the story is just attempting to have a funny twist ending, but the writing is so specific and creepy that I have to think it's real. I'm also pretty sure that in the story it mentions that the letter that she receives doesn't have like a postmark on it, like it was probably just dropped into her mailbox like deliberately or like directly. So that also makes me think that he probably is living in the chair, but it could again just be kind of a fake story. You can take it either way, but I think it's creepier if he's actually living in the chair, of course. This is one that I had never heard of before sitting down to write this video, and I'm glad that I found it. And it was actually turned into a manga by Junji Ito that I will definitely have to read. I'm sure that no matter how horrifying I imagine the story to be, he will definitely make it more horrifying than I could have ever imagined. The Man in the Black Suit is a short story by Stephen King about a young boy who goes fishing and encounters a strange man in a black suit that appears to be the devil. I don't really want to do a full spoiler breakdown for this one, as the interesting part to me is really kind of how it's written, so I don't think a synopsis will do it justice. This one is definitely a little creepy, but honestly nothing too disturbing happens except for one thing that the man in the suit says to the kid. He implies that something will happen to his mom, and then only leaving the kid and his dad, and then alludes to the fact that the kid will be sexually assaulted by his own father. But again, he only alludes to it. The other part that's kind of disturbing is they talk about how the kid's brother died the previous year from a bee sting. He was allergic to it, and it talks about kind of his swollen and enlarged face. A little creepy, but again, nothing too explicit or like that freaky, honestly. And those things are definitely only a tiny portion of the story, especially the first thing that I mentioned, but it definitely unsettled me because it just kind of comes out of nowhere. This is definitely one to check out if you like Stephen King. King himself has stated that he doesn't really like this story, but it didn't seem to be like of any less quality than what he normally writes, so I'm not sure why he wouldn't like this one in particular. That's not a slight on Stephen King, by the way. I really like Stephen King, especially his short stories. I love all his short stories, so it's interesting that he thinks this one is kind of worse quality because I think it's on par with everything else he's written, and that's a compliment for me. This is another one that you can find online for free across a number of different websites. It's probably around like 15 pages long, and it certainly sets up a really interesting mythology in a short story. If for nothing else, it would be a good story to read just to understand kind of that aspect of writing. Lamb to the Slaughter was written by Roald Dahl. Yes, that Roald Dahl, the guy that wrote Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. This is a story that I read in high school as a required reading exercise, and it's a great example of building suspense. The story follows a woman who commits a crime and then has to conceal that crime from the police that investigate it. She doesn't do the best job of covering her tracks, so the suspense comes from seeing whether she will be able to trick the cops or not. It's really interesting reading this story because I've had a lot of people mention that Roald Dahl's books in particular scared them when they were kids. I talked about witches in my Disturbing Kids book Iceberg video. I think it's really interesting to see him tackle something written for an older audience. I think it takes a lot of skill skill to write books for kids. I think some of the best authors are those that can keep the attention span of a kid throughout their entire novel. Roald Dahl has always been really good at that, and it's cool to see him write just something so different. Definitely give this one a read if it sounds interesting to you. This is one that you can find online for free. When I say you can find them online for free, most of these are taught in either like public schools or colleges, so there's typically a lot of free resources to access them, because typically if you teach something in a public school, it'll be available in like a government database or something like that, so that's why you can read them all for free. The Jaunt by Stephen King is a pretty famous short story, but it's kind of hard not to be famous when you're a short story written by Stephen King. But this is one of my favorites, and I've mentioned in the past and gotten roasted for admitting that I don't love Stephen King's novels, but I really love his short stories. I think they're his best work. I think they're almost all just fantastic. My biggest issue with a lot of Stephen King's writings, and I'm not saying he's a bad writer by any means, he's a masterful writer, but just for me personally, I think sometimes he takes kind of a long time to get to the point, which I know is appealing to a lot of people, and I think he's a fantastic writer, but something about the way that he structures his novels doesn't really draw me in as much as other authors. But his short stories don't have those issues at all, because they're short stories. And The Jaunt is a wonderful little short story that tackles science fiction in a really interesting way. It's about a future society that has colonized Mars, and we have a family that is getting ready to travel to the planet through something that is called the Jaunt. The Jaunt is essentially, and for all intents and purposes, teleportation. It lets people travel from Earth to Mars instantaneously. Throughout the story, the main character waits with his children as they prepare for the Jaunt in this, they call it the Jaunt terminal. It's like a bus terminal, but that's where they take you to do the Jaunt. And he tells the kids the story of the scientists that discovered the Jaunt. The story definitely has a disturbing ending, and there was another instance where a prisoner is used for an experiment that leads to a pretty troubling scene, I would say. It's not graphic in any way, though. It's mostly terrifying in like a psychological way. I'm going to spoil the story now, so if you're interested in it, then go ahead and read it and skip this next section. Spoilers ahead. Like I said, the story revolves around a man named Mark who is traveling to Mars with his family by means of the Jaunt. He's a businessman and is essentially going on an extended business trip to Mars, and he wants to take them with him. And he tells his two kids the story and the history of how the Jaunt was discovered. It's a story that's been passed down by a lot of people, but it's kind of rarely told by people. The Jaunt was discovered when a scientist was experimenting with teleportation, and he accidentally teleported two of his own fingers across the room. He looks down at his fingers and sees they've been teleported, and he freaks out because he thinks his fingers have been cut in half, but he realizes they're completely fine, and he starts to experiment by teleporting other objects across the room. After successfully teleporting a bunch of inorganic matter and other objects, he decides to try it with live mice. But when he teleports them, they all come out the other side either dead or just acting completely erratic and insane. He realizes that the only way to survive the Jaunt is to be sedated and unconscious when it happens. But the Jaunt needed human test subjects, so the government decided to put a couple of inmates on death row through the Jaunt while sedated. They emerge totally fine, but they decide to offer a murderer a full unconditional pardon, if he goes through the Jaunt while conscious, and he accepts this. When he emerges from the other side, he is completely insane. His hair has turned gray and white, and he is screaming that it's an eternity in there. It seems that while the Jaunt is instantaneous to the unconscious mind, it lasts an unimaginably long amount of time for the conscious mind, driving them mad. Mark thinks about this story of the prisoners, but he actually decides not to tell his family about it because it's their first time jaunting and he doesn't want to scare them. He's been doing it for a while. The attendants of the Jaunt terminal then begin to move through the terminal and use a gas anesthetic to knock everybody out like you do for surgery, and the family is put to sleep and they emerge on Mars instantly. When Mark wakes up, though, he can hear his son Ricky screaming, and Ricky has snow white hair and has been driven completely insane. And Mark says that Ricky, kind of being sort of a daredevil, decided to hold his breath while being sedated to experience the Jaunt while conscious because he wasn't fully warned of the consequences. Ricky has gone completely insane and attempts to gouge out his own eyes, and as he is wheeled away by the medical professionals at the Jaunt terminal, he screams and cackles and says, "Longer than you think, Dad. I saw, longer than you think." And that's when the story ends. So definitely pretty eerie. The idea that the kid lived through what must have been millions of years completely alone is certainly terrifying. Like I said, this one deals with more psychological horror than anything graphic. but that's pretty common with short horror stories I'm finding. The Metamorphosis by Franz Kafka is something that was suggested by one of my subscribers. I'm pretty sure this is actually a novella, although I found a short story version of it, but I think it might have just been like an abridged version of the full story. The story is about a man named Gregor who wakes up one morning and finds that he has been turned into a massive cockroach. The original story actually doesn't specify what he turns into. It just says that he was turned into a monstrous vermin, but a lot of adaptations depict him as a cockroach. And the story is weirdly sad for something that should be either like super horrifying or kind of funny. It's mostly just about a man who has to accept the fact that he cannot be loved by anyone and just has to exist in the society where he can't possibly fit in. He has everything taken from him given that he's now a massive cockroach, but he still has his human brain. This is definitely something to read if you like stories about kind of like transformations. I talked about in my kids' Iceberg one, I talked about one where a girl was put into the body of a chimp. Talked about The Fly before, so if you enjoyed like The Fly or that one, I forget the name of that other book, this one's definitely for you. It's more like of a human look of what would typically be portrayed as like a horror story. Like I said, it's just a very sad experience. It's kind of weird. The Cask of Amontillado is another short story by Edgar Allan Poe. I read this one my freshman year of high school and we watched it as a class. We watched like the short film version of it. And I remember everybody laughing at one particular point where two characters just kind of like scream a lot. I don't think we got the point of the story, and I'm sure my teacher was pretty upset by that. This one is about a man named Montresor that invites another man named Fortunato to try one of his fanciest wines that he has down in his family vaults, which kind of act more like catacombs. It's a pretty iconic horror story and has a pretty unnerving ending, especially if you're claustrophobic. Like everything Poe wrote, the main attraction to this story is really the prose. Every single sentence of this story just seems to sing. I mean, there's a reason that we're all still studying his stuff to this day. It really is that good. These short stories are really great to read if you're interested in kind of making the mundane sound incredibly interesting. That's not to say that this story is mundane. It's certainly not. It has a pretty eerie and wild ending, but Poe kind of manages to keep you on edge and really engaged with the story the entire time due to the way that he writes even the most simple sentences. It's seriously like magic. Go read this one again. You can find this one for free in so many places. Level 3. The Scythe by Ray Bradbury is a really interesting story that unsettled me more than I think it was supposed to. I'm going to really avoid spoilers for this one. Bradbury is another author that just makes every sentence so interesting. So definitely check this out if you're interested in some kind of like weird cryptic stuff. You're probably familiar with Bradbury, specifically for Fahrenheit 451, which is a book that I think a lot of people have to read in high school. I didn't have to read it, but I think my wife read in high school. She actually reread in college and really loved it. I read Something Wicked This Way Comes last year by Ray Bradbury and loved it. So he's just another fantastic author. You should check out all this stuff. But this story in particular is about a man who inherits a house and then comes to learn of kind of all the responsibilities that he has taken on without really realizing that. That's really all I can say without spoiling the premise to this one. It's one that you could kind of guess the end to most likely while you're reading it, but it's written so well that it doesn't matter and honestly could probably slip past your mind anyway. If any of my fellow Deer Hunter fans are watching this video, I'll just say that this short story feels like it inspired a particular song on the Act 5 album, which is actually right behind me. I never show it because I'm always, yeah, you see right there, that's my Act 5 album. So if you're watching this also and you have no idea who the Deer Hunter is, then please just go listen to the album Act 4, Rebirth and Reprise, and be ready to have your mind blown by like literally the greatest band on the planet. But enough talking about the Deer Hunter, although I do have a 5-video series where I break down the lore and meaning of all of the albums and the most popular series that they have, so you should watch those. But I'm actually done talking about the Deer Hunter now. Go read The Scythe by Ray Bradbury. It's really eerie and fun and really short as well. The Lottery by Shirley Jackson is one of my favorite short stories that I have ever read. I read it in my high school English class for the first time, and it's really stuck with me ever since. I think it was like kind of one of the first times I read something kind of messed up for a school assignment, and I loved it. It's about a town that gathers all of its citizens together one day in July to conduct the annual town lottery in which everybody participates. That's all I can say without spoiling it, and I seriously recommend giving it a read. If you haven't yet, it's short, but full of spoilers ahead for the entire story. Like I said, the story starts with a small farming village gathering in the town square to celebrate their year of bountiful harvests and to choose a winner for the town lottery. We're introduced to Mr. Summers, who is the man that is conducting the lottery. We learn that every other village also conducts the same lottery every year, but some towns have actually stopped doing the annual lottery, and this upsets some of the older men in the village who see the lottery as kind of an essential part to their farming lifestyle, their way of life. As the townspeople all gather in the square, children are playing in the streets, and the children kind of play this game where they work to collect a large pile of stones, and they all kind of like guard their own respective piles from the other kids who try to take them for their things. It's all a very happy and fun affair. It reminds me of something I would have done when I was a kid, like a pinecone war. But there is kind of this tension in the air that hangs over the town that you can feel, again, because Shirley Jackson's just an amazing and perfect writer. Mr. Summers stands in front of the crowd, and he pulls out a black box, and he places it on a stool, and the box is full of slips of paper that he then mixes around with his hands. And before the lottery can begin, Mr. Summers is sworn in as the caretaker of the lottery by the postmaster. It's all a very official proceeding. Mr. Summers starts calling out names and making sure that everybody in the town is in attendance. We learn that each of the heads of the family are the ones that go up and take their papers from the box, and those families without a father have their slips chosen by the mother or their oldest son if he's at least 16 years old. As the men go up to take their slips and play the lottery, the people in the crowd kind of make awkward small talk and banter. It seems everybody is kind of in a rush to get home. They have dinner waiting for them, and they know that only one person will win the lottery. And to some people, it just kind of feels like a waste of time at this point. All the men pick their slips, and kind of a murmur starts among the crowd, and they all ask who pulled the winning slip, the slip with the black dot on it. After a few minutes, we learn that Bill Hutchinson was the one who pulled it, and Bill and his family are invited to come up to the front of the crowd. Bill's wife, Tessie, is kind of unnerved by the whole thing. She keeps repeating that Bill didn't have enough time to pull the slip that he wanted and that it wasn't fair, but she is told to be a good sport about the whole affair, and Bill just tells her to calm down. Bill and Tessie make their way to the front of the crowd and are asked by Mr. Summers how many children they have, and they say that they have 3 young children, and the kids are invited to the front, and the slips are collected by Mr. Summers from all the men in the town. He then puts 4 blank slips back in the black box again, along with Bill's original slip, the one with the black dot on it, and Tessie keeps insisting that they start over, but Mr. Summers isn't having any of it, and the kids are marched up to pick a slip from the box, and little Davy, the youngest kid, is so short that he has to be helped by his older brother, and he tries to take multiple slips, and the crowd laughs, and Mr. Summers reminds him to just take one. He only gets one chance. The 3 Hutchinson kids, Harry, Nancy, and Davy, pick their slips and are followed quickly by their parents. Mr. Summers tells them to keep all their slips folded in their hands, and the crowd starts to murmur, and a voice says that they hope it isn't Nancy. The family opens their papers from youngest to oldest. Davy opens his, and it's blank, and a sigh of relief washes over the crowds. Harry and Nancy reveal blank slips, and they turn to the crowd cheering and laughing. Bill opens his, it's blank as well, and the attention of the crowd turns to Tessie. Tessie Hutchinson stands staring straight ahead, and she keeps the paper held firmly in her hand, and Bill has to force it out of her hand, and he reveals that it's the slip with a black dot on it. Mr. Summers tells the crowd to finish quickly, and these are the last couple paragraphs of the story. Although the villagers had forgotten the ritual and lost the original black box, they still remembered to use stones. The pile of stones the boys had made earlier was ready. There were stones on the ground with the blowing scraps of paper that had come out of the box. The children had stones already, and someone gave little Davy Hutchinson a few pebbles. Tessie Hutchinson was in the center of a cleared space by now, and she held her hands out desperately as the villagers moved in on her. "It isn't fair," she said. A stone hit her on the side of the head. "It isn't fair, it isn't right," Mrs. Hutchinson screamed, and then they were upon her. Isn't that the coolest and creepiest story that you've ever heard of? When I first read this in high school, our teacher had us all read it individually during silent reading, and you could physically and audibly hear when the other students got to the end. I'm a pretty quick reader, and I remember audibly gasping when I read that they were stoning Tessie to death. I think the way that my teacher had it printed, and I don't know if he did this on purpose, but it was definitely a page turn that got to the part where it says Tessie was hit on the side of the head with a stone. And I just sat there and watched every other student get to that part in the story and then react viscerally to what they were reading. It's a perfect story. The story is pretty tame in terms of actual violence. It's not graphic, but it's one of the most effective pieces of horror that I have ever read. And I've been asked to cover a lot of splatterpunk books on this channel. If you don't know what those are, they're kind of extremely disturbing books meant to be just as foul as possible. Think of Cows, which is something that I covered in my first Disturbing Books Iceberg video. And I do want to cover some of those books because I have read some of them and I find them interesting. But in my opinion, this short story, The Lottery, is far more disturbing than any extreme violence or gore that I've ever read. There's something so real about Tessie Hutchinson pleading for her life, and there was something so sad about her little son Davy being given his very own little pebbles to throw at her. The story takes place in a world where these people are convinced that brutally sacrificing one of their own every year will bring them just a bountiful harvest. It's brilliant and terrifying, and Shirley Jackson is truly one of the greatest authors to ever live. She was a genius. The Most Dangerous Game is a short story by Richard Connell about a big game hunter that ends up stranded on Ship Trap Island, where he meets the intimidating General Zaroff, who invites him into his home for dinner and shelter. Zaroff reveals that he lives on the island with his servant and is also a big game hunter himself that has grown tired of hunting animals, and he now hunts something that could actually pose a threat and a challenge to him: the most dangerous game, humans. I won't spoil this story. I pretty much just covered like the first couple paragraphs. This is one that I had to read in high school, and I liked it at the time. It's like a cool survival story with a lot of tension and suspense to it. It's one of those concepts that feels like kind of a cliche now, but it wasn't at the time. It was one of the first stories to ever do it. It's kind of like how in the book Treasure Island, the big mystery is to find out who the pirate on board of the ship is, and you have like a couple suspicious characters, and then you're introduced to Long John Silver, a man who has an eye patch, a peg leg, and a parrot. And of course, you know right away that he is the pirate, and it's kind of funny to think that it could be anyone else when Silver literally has the 3 massive iconic hallmarks of being a pirate, but it's only obvious to us because Treasure Island was the book that established all those tropes in the first place. But back to The Most Dangerous Game for a second. This one is also iconic to me for another reason. My brothers and I used to play this like all the time growing up. Like we would send one of us out to hide with a little rubber knife, like a play knife, and the others would hunt that person with Nerf guns. It led to so many insanely suspenseful moments. I was usually the one that was hunted, and I remember once hiding in the shower and like completely surprising my older brother in like a reverse Psycho situation. My brothers and I had some weird games growing up. We just like, kind of had these weird imaginative games. So let me know if you and your family ever created any other fun games based on famous literature, I guess. The Landlady is another short story by Roald Dahl that I read in middle school, and this one freaked me out at the time. I remember not really understanding it fully at first, but our teacher made sure to do her best to traumatize us by explaining what the ending implies. It's the story of a 17-year-old kid named Billy that is looking for a place to live, and he comes across a boarding house and feels strangely compelled to go inside. He sees a sleeping parrot and a napping dog inside, and he finds this comforting. He ends up meeting the landlady, the woman that owns the place, and he learns that there have only been 2 other men that have stayed there, and they were there more than 2 years ago, and he decides to keep the old woman company and sit down and have some tea with her. That's all I'll say about this one because I feel like I'm kind of spoiling a lot of these, and I want to make sure that I leave some for you guys to read on your own. This one is really eerie. The old woman seems nice, but you guys know what video you're watching. Something is definitely off with her. When I first read this in middle school, my English teacher was an older woman. She was probably in her 60s and like really close to retirement. And I could only think of her the entire time we read about this like creepy old woman. And I can still only picture her today when I read this story. It has a really creepy ending, and it's one of those stories that we will read and then realize just how many other things that you've seen or read that have been inspired by it. That's one of my favorite aspects of reading some of these old horror stories. They show you how some of those classic horror tropes were established and how they've evolved over time. In the Hills, the Cities by Clive Barker is a wild short story about a gay couple traveling through the Soviet Union and coming across a battle that is waged every 10 years between 2 towns. If that sounds interesting, then give it a read because I will be giving full spoilers ahead. The story starts out with Mick driving through Yugoslavia with his new partner Judd. Mick appears to be already growing tired of Judd, who constantly drones on about politics and is a lot more kind of like conservative and right-wing than Mick thought he would be. Judd can't ever stop talking about boring politics, and Mick decides that he'll ditch them after their honeymoon. Judd is also unhappy with Mick since he doesn't see him as on the same level as him intellectually, and the 2 men are driving to a monastery that Mick wants to see, and Judd starts to argue with him, saying that all the monasteries are the same. Mick yells at Judd to stop the car, and then seduces Judd, and the 2 make love in the wheat field they're driving through. It's kind of odd. We are then given the point of view of a Soviet Union leader who seems to be preparing his and the neighboring city for some sort of celebration. He remarks that they feel blessed to live in the Soviet Union and scoffs at the Americans with their simple pleasures. We go back to Mick and Judd, who stay at a bed and breakfast and then head back out onto the road. They get lost a couple of hours in and refer to their map, and they can see civilians marching in the distance, and the Soviet leader explains, again moving back to his perspective, that the city and the neighboring city are about to engage in ritual war that they do once every 10 years. Every single member of the city is assembling on the battleground and getting ready to fight the other citizens to the death. Notably, the leader mentions that this is something that all of the civilians join in enthusiastically. They aren't forced into the conflict, but they enjoy the battle. Again, it's something that happens every 10 years, and they all kind of look forward to it. But this is a Clive Barker story. If you don't know who Clive Barker is, he's the guy who wrote The Hellbound Heart, which turned into Hellraiser. He has another story that we're going to talk about on this list later. His stuff is weird. Again, Hellraiser is about essentially sex demons that show up and force you to experience so much pleasure and pain that you become something other than a human. It's very weird. But since this is a Clive Barker story, it can't just be two cities fighting each other. No. Every member of the city links up to essentially form one giant person, like some sort of weird rock'em sock'em robot made out of people. I don't know how it works, but that's how these people fight each other. They literally all link up into one giant person and fight to the death. It's absolutely wild. But anyways, Judd and Mick are lost on the road and they hear these loud kind of pounding sounds. And these are the sounds of the two cities fighting. And we're told about how one of the cities defeats the other, leaving all 30,000 of the conjoined individuals of the defeated city just lying in a bloody pile of human gore. Judd wants to investigate, but Mick wants to leave it alone. Judd gets out of the car and they come upon the massive pile of dead and dying bodies, just men, women, and children piled up and moaning in pain. And a man walks from body to body, shooting the living people in the head to end their suffering. Judd tries to ask the man about what happened, but the man doesn't speak any English, and he simply takes his revolver and shoots himself in the head, ending his own life. Mick and Judd race back to their car, but it's being stolen by the Soviet leader that we talked about earlier. He says that he was the referee for the battle, and he's now worried that the massive city person that won the fight is on its way to destroy more cities, and he can't let that happen. He drives away in the car, and the couple pursues after him, and they find him that night having driven the car into a sinkhole. The leader is in bad shape, and before he dies, he explains to them about this giant made of human flesh, and he says they have perfected their design, and now the giant will roam the earth, killing everything in its path. The men think he is absolutely insane, as you would, and they head to the hills where they find a small farmhouse. Inside the farmhouse, a nice woman and her husband give the men some dinner, and the two men pass out at the table. They wake up to the sound of crashing, terrible, thunderous footsteps, and the giant is approaching them. The husband and the wife leave the house to get a better view and are crushed by the giant, and the house falls down, and Mick and Judd are left to stare up at this horrifying monstrosity in awe, and as the cottage is kicked by the giant, a stone flies and hits Judd in the head, killing him. But at this point, Mick is honestly just too enamored and obsessed with the giant to care. He notices that the giant is made of so many people, and that several of them have died at this point, and their lifeless bodies just hang from the harnesses as the entire giant moves as one, not paying any heed to the dead people inside of it. The story ends with Mick hitching a ride on the giant's foot and being essentially absorbed into it, and he is happy and glad to be part of the whole, and the giant continues on, presumably to kill and destroy everything in its path. So yeah, really, really weird, right? I didn't know what to expect from this going in, but the giant flesh, rock'em sock'em, human pyramid golem certainly came out of left field for me at least. I'm sure the story has something to do with being a critique of like the Soviet Union and the way things go there and how it compares to America. The imagery of like the collective forming one body certainly fits kind of that theme. But overall, the story is pretty good, although I think the premise, at least to me, is a little too silly to be all that disturbing. It was a great read though, and I don't think I've ever read anything by Clive Barker that I didn't like. He has like a really unique way of expressing horror that I really appreciate. The Veldt by Ray Bradbury is one that a commenter recommended, and when I started reading it, I did one of those like Ratatouille flashbacks because I swear I read this in middle school. It's a science fiction story about a futuristic automated house that essentially takes care of the family. The two children have a nursery that can use kind of virtual reality technology to simulate any setting, but the house is seemingly stuck on creating a wild African veldt, which is an African environment where lions are shown to be eating other animals, and this obviously concerns the parents. I'm not spoiling this one for you guys, so go read it. That sounds interesting. This one definitely has aspects of like creepy kids horror that we all know and love, and it has a pretty disturbing ending that kind of implies more than it actually shows. This is one that kind of sits with you while you slowly start to piece it all together and like understand what most likely happened to this family. Definitely want to check out if you like sci-fi. I remember liking this story in middle school, but I completely forgotten about it until I read it again for this video. It holds up really well, like everything that Ray Bradbury writes. Level 4. Rabbit Stew by Mickey Mares is probably the most obscure story on this list, and I only found it due to an old Reddit thread. It was printed in the Disney magazine, and the author was 13 when she first wrote it, and it's absolutely wild that Disney ever printed this in their magazine. Spoilers ahead. This one is super short. It follows Rachel, a young girl whose grandpa has recently moved in with her and her mother. And Grandpa was put in a rest home after his wife died, and he seems to have some trouble remembering things. He seems to be kind of losing it a little bit. Rachel is playing with her pet bunny when her grandpa comes in the room and tells her that her bunny looks just like the rabbits that he and Grandma raised and then butchered. And he says that Grandma could never stomach killing the animals, but he would twist their little necks and chop them up into stew. Rachel is understandably freaked out by this, but she dismisses it. And the next morning, she is cutting a sandwich that she's making for lunch with a large knife, and the grandpa says that it looks just like the one that he used to use to make bunny stew. And Rachel asks her mom about Grandpa, and she says that he's a little out of it, but he's harmless. The next day at school, Rachel's class is putting on an Easter play, and Rachel has been chosen to play the Easter Bunny. She performs the play and wants to show her bunny costume off to her mom, and the teacher lets her wear the costume home and bring it back the next day. When Rachel gets home, she can smell a strange scent in the air. She sees her grandpa in the kitchen stirring a large pot, and she asks him what he is making, and he says a tasty stew, and she looks in the pot and is horrified to see the lifeless eyes of her pet bunny staring back at her. So pretty freaky, right? Definitely something that would have traumatized me growing up. I still have a hard time with like animal violence, and the idea that your crazy grandpa would kill and cook your sweet little pet is kind of unsettling, but I guess it's not that crazy. I mean, the story is over, right? Grandpa turned and looked at her, clutching a bloody knife in his hands. His eyes widened and a strange grimace spread across his face. "Another bunny," he growled, pointing at Rachel. "Another big fat bunny for my rabbit stew." Rachel screamed and began backing away from the crazed old man. "Grandpa, no, I'm not a bunny," she cried. "It's me, Rachel." The old man just smiled and muttered happily. "You're a fat little bunny. You'll be perfect for my stew." "Grandpa," she pleaded, "it's me, Rachel." She felt her back hit the wall. Grandpa had cornered her and was blocking all the escape routes. She screamed in terror as the old man raised the knife. "Please, Grandpa, no!" About 15 minutes later, Rachel's mom arrived home from work. As she opened the front door, a strange smell filled the air. "Dad, what are you cooking?" she asked. "A tasty rabbit stew," the old man replied. Disney, what were you thinking? I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream by Harlan Ellison is a science fiction story that is very well known. I covered this one in more detail in one of my other Iceberg videos, so I'll just talk about it a little bit for this video and try not to retread the same ground. This is a post-apocalyptic novel about the 5 remaining human survivors on an Earth that has been completely overrun by a single supercomputer that hates humanity and tortures the survivors every second of their lives. It's a really fascinating story and kind of plays with the idea of an evil or vengeful god, only this god was a man-made machine that has essentially ascended to godhood through technological means. The story is pretty bleak, but has kind of a hopeful ending, as hopeful as it can be in this situation. This is an absolutely must-read if you like science fiction. I really love stories that play with the ideas of humans resisting something that is like all-knowing or all-powerful or like super oppressive. I'm currently working a little bit on a novel that plays around with that idea, and I just find it really fascinating. The disturbing parts of this story come from some of the violence and torture that the computer puts the humans through, but in my opinion, the most disturbing part is everything involving the only female human survivor. She was an incredibly smart female scientist before the computer took over, but he has twisted her brain into only craving sex all the time, and she's regularly abused by all the men in the group, and just seems like such a sad existence to be living in. She easily has it the worst, in my opinion. But if that sounds depressing, and you're looking for something depressing, then definitely give it a read. It's a famous story for a reason. It's very good and will stick with you for a long time after you read it. I'm not a huge science fiction guy, but I love this story. And I should say that somebody just recently, I think today, commented that this was turned into a video game in the 90s, like a point-and-click video game, which I think I'd heard of that before, but I've never played it, but that would be something to check out if you're a fellow video gamer like myself. The Raft by Stephen King is kind of a funny B-movie type story that gets a little gruesome and a little sexual, but it's mostly a good time. This feels like prime Stephen King when he was writing all of his stories with a little help from his friend. If you know what I mean, then you know what I mean. It's about a group of kids that are attacked by what is essentially an evil oil slick that hunts them down and tries to kill them in gruesome ways. Does that sound insane? It definitely is. This is definitely one to check out if you're into more kind of like horror comedy books and movies. I had a lot of fun with this one, and it's just cool to see just how versatile King is at writing different kinds of horror. He has a short story in the last layer of this iceberg that made me gag and was so unbelievably gross. So seeing something kind of fun and wacky is really cool. He just has really good range as a writer. A Good Man is Hard to Find by Flannery O'Connor was one that was suggested by one of my subscribers, and I really enjoyed the story. It's definitely one of the more intense ones in my opinion, and I'll give you kind of the short synopsis before going into spoilers. It's a story about a family going on a road trip. The family consists of two parents, their infant child, and their two other children that are around 8 years old, and the grandma as well, who is probably the most prominent character in the story. The family runs into some trouble and some pretty upsetting things happen. Like I said, I really enjoyed this story. It was one of the first ones that I read for this video specifically that actually disturbed me. I could just picture it all happening so vividly. I think all of the character work is really well done, and it's really interesting and just impressive given that it's only a couple pages long. If you're interested in this, from what I've told you about it so far, then go ahead and skip the spoiler section and read it for yourself. You can find it online for free like you can do for most of these. But if you want to hear me explain it and go kind of in depth on it, then let's get into it. So full spoilers ahead for A Good Man is Hard to Find. The story starts with the family getting ready to go on a road trip, and the grandma is lecturing her son, Bailey, about staying away from Florida since there is an escaped convict named the Misfit on the loose, and she's worried they'll run into him in Florida. The family insists on taking the trip to Florida anyway, and the grandma joins them a little bit reluctantly. The family starts the drive and stops for food at a little restaurant and mechanic shop where they meet the owner and his wife. The grandma and the owner's wife talk about the Misfit and how they're scared of running into him. The children on the trip constantly make rude remarks and seem to not have very good manners in general. The grandma talks about the current state of the world and how things seem to be getting worse, and she says that a good man is hard to find nowadays. After the family eats their lunch, they continue towards Florida, and grandma is reminded of an old plantation house that she used to visit and asks Bailey if they can stop there. He doesn't want to and insists that they just keep driving, and grandma tells the kids that there is a secret panel hiding a secret room in the house, and they loudly demand their father take them there, and they kick the seat. Bailey reluctantly turns the car around and starts driving down the dirt road to the old plantation. He isn't happy about the situation, but the grandma is thrilled, and she reveals that she lied to the kids about the secret panel, but thinks that it was a necessary lie in order to get Bailey to drive them to the house. A couple things happen next that lead to a bad series of events. Bailey takes a turn in the car at the same time that the family's cat, who's in the back seat, attacks him essentially, and they run into an unexpected drop-off, and the car rolls over and then lands in a ditch, and the family gets out, and the kids happily exclaim that they've been in an accident, and they seem slightly disappointed that everybody seems to be all right. The family collects themselves and starts to wonder how they will get out of this situation. They can't push their car out of the ditch, and even if they could, they would need to repair the car. And as they're wondering what to do, another car appears on the road at the top of the ditch. 3 men get out of the car, an older man and 2 younger ones. The kids repeat that they have had an accident, and the men stand on the ledge of the ditch and assess the situation. The older man tells the kids and the family to gather together, and he says that kids make him nervous. The kids rudely ask why he gets to boss them around, and Bailey cuts them off, noticing that all 3 of the men have guns. Grandma then panics as she recognizes the older man as the Misfit, and she loudly exclaims that she knows who he is. The Misfit tells her that she is correct. He is, in fact, the Misfit, but he tells her that it would have been better for everyone if she hadn't recognized him, and Bailey tries to cover for her, saying that she doesn't know what she's talking about. Grandma is just a complete wreck at this point. She's completely flustered, and she asks the Misfit if he would shoot a lady. She makes it sound like she wouldn't expect him to shoot a lady, and he says that he would hate to have to. And one of the 2 men with the Misfit takes a look at the car and says it'll take about a half hour to fix. The Misfit then tells Bailey to take his son with him into the forest along with the 2 men. They all march off into the forest, Bailey making sure to follow all of the instructions. Grandma continues to talk to the Misfit. She's still in the ditch with the mother and the daughter and their infant child. And she says that he seems like a nice person and like he comes from nice people. And the Misfit says that his parents were both wonderful people, the nicest people on the planet. The Misfit says that he is not a good person, though. He says that he is a different breed from his parents. And he explains that he and his two friends escaped the prison and buried their clothes, and they need new shirts. And Grandma says they can have some of Bailey's clothes, and the Misfit thanks her. She continues to try to reason with the Misfit. She asks him if he prays, and he says that he doesn't. She encourages him to, and then she hears 2 gunshots from the forest. The Misfit says that he's been everywhere and seen everything. He's even seen a man burned alive once. He says that he was a good kid until he wasn't, and he says that he was sent to the penitentiary and told that he murdered his own father, but he doesn't remember it happening that way. The 2 men emerge from the woods. One of them is dragging Bailey's shirt behind him, and Bailey and his son are nowhere to be seen. As Grandma continues to plead with the Misfit, he calmly explains his life, and he says that he doesn't particularly believe in God at all. The Grandma says that he could be a good man, and he refuses the notion, and he has his assistants lead Bailey's wife, her infant son, and their daughter into the woods. He makes sure that the daughter is holding the hands of one of the 2 men, and she calls the man a pig, and the man laughs before they all head into the forest. The Misfit says that it's Jesus' fault that everything is off balance in the world. He says that Jesus should have never raised the dead. He says that you can either follow him or reject him and enjoy your short life by killing and looting and attacking people and living with no consequences. There's a scream from the forest followed by a gunshot. 2 more gunshots follow shortly afterwards. The Misfit seems upset at this point. He hits the ground with his fists and says that he wishes he could have been there when Jesus raised the dead, so he could have been sure of something if he had just witnessed it. The Grandma tells the Misfit that she believes that he could be a good man, and she reaches out to touch him, and he recoils. It says he recoils like she's a snake, and he shoots her 3 times in the chest, killing her. He sits there and cleans his glasses, and the 2 men return to see the Grandma sitting in her own blood, smiling up at the sky. The Misfit instructs his goons to take the Grandma and put her where they put the other members of the family. One of the goons laughs and says that she was a real talker. The Misfit says she would have been a good woman if someone was threatening to shoot her all her life. One of the men laughs and says this is all some fun, and the Misfit tells him to shut up and says that there is no real pleasure in life. This story really got to me for some reason. I think it's the way that the Grandma kind of pleads with the Misfit. It seems like everyone else in the situation knows what's about to happen, and she's the only one who thinks she can change things, but she ends up dead just like the rest of the family. Also, the detail of the mother and the daughter and the infant being led into the woods, and it says they hear a scream and then 3 gunshots. To me, it really seems like that scream is the mother seeing her own husband and son dead and then realizing what's about to happen, and then she's killed. That's really freaky to me. It's a pretty simple story, but the Misfit is a really compelling character in my opinion. He reminds me a lot of Anton Chigurh from No Country for Old Men, somebody who is just completely unfeeling and can't be persuaded away from his murderous intentions. I'm really glad this story was recommended. I can't remember who recommended it, but thank you so much. I really loved reading this. Where Are You Going? Where Have You Been? Is a short story by Joyce Carol Oates. I had originally planned to do a deeper dive on this one, but I actually think that I'm not the best person to do a deep dive on this for a reason that I'll talk about in a second. The story centers on a teenage girl named Connie who is at odds with her parents. She wants to go out with boys and enjoy her youth, but her parents think she is far too reckless and isn't serious about her future. The beginning of the story is Connie going out with her friends. On her outings, she notices a particular man who keeps eyeing her. He says that he is going to take her out someday, and Connie is flattered, and the story kind of picks up when Connie is home alone and this person, a man named Arnold Friend, shows up in his car to take her out on a date. There is something so menacing about Arnold Friend and the way that he talks to Connie. It's like he always knows what she's thinking. I believe the story is kind of trying to call into question whether Arnold is a regular human or something else. The reason why I think that I'm not the best person to do a full deep dive is that I think this story is really much more terrifying for women than it is for men. It's about a girl who quickly finds herself at the whims of a strange man who could overpower her or take her and no one would notice. The power dynamic between the two is just so heavily weighted towards Arnold's side, especially since he has a buddy of his in the car. It's just very eerie and it makes you feel very uncomfortable the whole time. Give this one a read if it sounds interesting to you. It's a really great read and it's a very quick read as well. A Perfect Day for a Banana Fish is a story by J.D. Salinger, who is probably best known for The Catcher in the Rye. I read that book in high school and I really liked it. It's a good book to read if you're an angsty, emo teenager like I was. This story is a really quick story about a man named Seymour that is currently on vacation with his girlfriend. He is a war veteran and his girlfriend's parents don't really approve of him. They think he's mentally unwell. The story kind of has two different narratives in it, with one of them being Seymour convincing a young girl to go hunting for banana fish with him. It's a very uncomfortable scenario and it's just written so well. Seymour is really interesting. You can never quite tell what he's going to do and what his motives are. It keeps a lot of suspense in the story that way. This one is super short and you can find it online. It's got a pretty disturbing ending, although I will say that it doesn't go in the direction that you were probably expecting when you heard me talk about him convincing a little girl to go fishing with him. It's a story that's still sitting with me as I record this video. I'm still kind of digesting it. I'm not quite sure what to make of the ending. I think I'll need to go back and read it several times before I can fully understand all of the characters and why the story ends the way that it does. It was a fantastic recommendation though, and I'm really glad that I read it. Level 5. The Bloody Chamber by Angela Carter is a short story about a woman who marries an older French marquis whose previous 3 wives have died under mysterious circumstances. The story follows the woman as she discovers the dark secret that her new husband is hiding. This was another suggestion and another really great read that I don't want to spoil. Just know that there is some murder and some weird pervy stuff in this one, so if that's not your jam, then definitely stay away. If you want a creepy mystery, then go ahead and read it. It's really good. Through making this video, I've discovered that I often love horror written by women. I think there's kind of a tendency for some horror writers to try to shock their audience with kind of gross, perverted, and sexual stuff, and can come off feeling a little degrading towards women. That's certainly not the case for all male horror authors, but some of the lower stuff in the Disturbing Books Iceberg feels that way. Women authors often capture the uneasy feeling of being watched or followed or feeling powerless really well because they unfortunately have almost all been in situations like that. That's one thing that I think makes Shirley Jackson's horror so effective, and I feel the same way about this story. So if you're interested in more intense literature but are worried about the portrayal of defenseless women in a way that feels almost fetishistic, then I would really read this story. It has a lot of those elements, but it feels a lot less icky due to how it is written and the fact that it was written by a female author. The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas by Ursula K. Le Guin is another short story that I read in high school, and it's one that has stuck with me ever since. I actually just recently emailed my high school senior year literature teacher to thank him personally. I wasn't the best student my senior year of high school, and I probably skipped his class about twice a week, but I always really enjoyed how he taught, and I now, make money making YouTube videos about literature, so I figured I would apologize and tell him that he really did have a good impact on me. He responded very nicely and said that he remembers me and my 2 best friends in that class. He's still teaching the story to this day, actually, which is wonderful because it's amazing and also pretty messed up. There's going to be full spoilers ahead for this one. I do recommend this story, but I'm going to go through it all right now. The story opens with a few paragraphs dedicating to describing the wonders of the festival of summer in the city of Omelas. We are told of the dancers, the horses with gold and silver braided into their manes, of the food and wine, of the laughter and cheer of everybody in the city. We are told of the children playing around, the musicians all playing in unison, the flower petals in the air. We are even told that men and women walk around nude with no fear of judgment. Omelas is a wonderful city with no oppression and no organized religion, but there are still religious people. It's just a wonderful place. The narrator invites us to imagine Omelas as we see fit, and we are told that Omelas doesn't pertain to a specific time period, but that it is a utopia, a city above all others where every citizen is happy and there are no hardships or famines or wars or crimes. Then the narrator starts to sense that we might not believe them, that we can't quite imagine this perfect city of Omelas. And the narrator then tells us of one last scene from the city that will surely get us to comprehend Omelas and to accept the reality of the utopia. We are told, though the details do keep kind of changing and fluctuating in and out, of a small room in the cellar of a public building or under one of the ornate houses. And this room is dirty and it has no windows, only has a locked door. It is 3 paces long and 2 paces wide. It is cut off from sunlight and contains a couple of mops with dirty, foul-smelling mop heads. In this room, there is also a child. They say it could be a boy or a girl. It looks to be about 6 years old, but is actually 10. The child is malnourished and naked, and it sits in a pile of its own waste, and its legs and buttocks are a mess of painful sores. The child is terrified of the mops. It may have been beaten with them before. The door to this prison is always locked, except for sometimes when a group of people come to see the child. They swear at it, kick at it, make it stand up, and show it off to a group, and fill the water bowl with some water, and they give it some grease and cornmeal to eat every day. The child hasn't always lived in the room, and it remembers its mother and the sunlight outside. It begs to be let out. It swears it'll be good and that it will behave, but the door is always hastily shut in its face, and locked quickly afterwards. The child used to scream and plead at night, but now it only makes weak, whimpering noises. It knows that it will never be let out of the room and will live in complete misery for the rest of its life, and everyone in Omelas knows about this child. It is explained to all the kids when they are the right age to understand. They are told about the misery of the child and they are brought down to see it. They often cry or look away in shame, but everyone has to see the child. The city of Omelas depends on everybody seeing the child. They say the terms are strict and absolute. There may not even be one kind word spoken to the child. The young people that see it often go home in fits of tears or in throes of anger. They find themselves outraged at the suffering of the child, but they don't do much else about it. They learn to accept the suffering of the child and they try to put it out of their minds. You see, the entire city of Omelas, all of the happiness and prosperity and celebration and grandeur depends on the sole misery of that one child. If the child is not miserable, then the city cannot have its utopia, and everyone knows this. The narrator asks us if we can accept this, if we can understand that Omelas is utopia built on something so horrible, but that this is necessary. But before we can give our response, the narrator describes one final scene for us. Sometimes, either after seeing the child for the first time, or sometimes during any ordinary night, someone from Omelas will leave the city. They will get up with no explanation, maybe wiping a tear from their eye, and set out. No one knows where they're headed, the ones who walk away from Omelas. And this is where the story ends. This is just so brilliant to me. It feels very similar to the lottery and that the prosperity of the group depends on the sacrifice of an individual, but this story just feels more intense in the way that it describes the suffering of the child. It's just brilliant. I love the ending where we are told about the people that leave Omelas, the people that realize that their happiness is not worth the suffering that they have seen. They make the decision to leave and reject this perfect city since they know what that perfection costs. It's one of those stories that I can never really truly explain to someone. I think about it all the time. It feels like the message or moral should be simple, but it always ends up being something kind of more complex in my mind when I try to wrap my head around the story. I would seriously give this one a read if you haven't. I described a lot of it, but the actual writing is a lot more effective, and it's also a really short story. It'll probably take you about 10 minutes to read, and you can find it for free online. The Box Social by James Reaney is a really creepy story. It's about a girl who is preparing her lunch for a Box Social. Box Socials were kind of these old social gatherings where women would prepare meals and put them in shoeboxes, and the men would bid on them, essentially like bidding to go on a date with that particular girl. I don't want to spoil this one at all. It is probably the shortest one on this list. I will say that it has something to do with harm coming to children, kind of. So if you don't want to read about that, then maybe skip this one. It's one that just keeps you thinking for a while afterwards. I know this is another one that is often read in high school, and this is one that even I might think is like a little beyond what I would consider appropriate. Maybe like a senior year literature class could tackle this, but the implications of the end of the story are really unsettling. It's a really great read though. Check it out if you have a couple minutes and then let me know what you think about it. Guts by Chuck Palahniuk is a short story from his book Haunted. This one is pretty infamous and I actually covered it in another video before, but I felt that it just had to be on this list because it's honestly really gross and I want to put myself and you guys through that pain again. It centers around 3 occurrences of a man pleasuring himself, if you know what I'm saying. One of the times he sticks some candle wax through the hole that he pees out of, and it gets stuck in his bladder. Sorry that you have to live with that image now. I can literally like feel that as I'm talking about it. Another one is honestly the least outrageous of the 3. As a kid, he sticks a carrot up his butt and his mom ends up finding it. Kind of weird and gross, but not nearly as bad as the other 2. The last one is the most famous and is kind of known for being horrifying, but also kind of funny. It's kind of a horror comedy. The guy sits on the water intake valve of his swimming pool, like the bottom of the swimming pool underwater, because he likes the way that it makes him feel, like the suction, but the suction gets turned up a little bit too high and it causes his innards to be sucked out of himself and they get tangled in the pool filter. The guy ends up having to chew through his own intestines in order to escape, but he actually survives this though somehow. And he also talks about in his family, they have multiple instances where people have died from autoerotic asphyxiation, but the family just has to keep it a secret from everyone since it's kind of embarrassing that it happened multiple times. So really gross, but also comedic. I think that's why I didn't put it in the last layer. I don't think this one is quite as depressing as some of the stuff that's down there, but this one definitely isn't for you if you're particularly squeamish. The Goatman story is a creepypasta written by a user named Anasazi. I'm trying to avoid creepypasta on this iceberg, but this one was particularly good. I think it has a lot more going on than like most creepypasta do. I won't do an in-depth analysis for this one, but it's about a guy talking about a camping trip that he took where he and his friends were stalked by a strange creature that they refer to as the Goat Man. This creature can mimic other humans and is just generally pretty terrifying. There is nothing graphic in this story, but there is a particularly good description of what the creature sounds like, specifically what it sounds like when it's trying to mimic human speech. The story is written really well and it feels like just the right amount of confusing. I'm pretty lukewarm on most creepypasta, but this one is short and it's really well done. I figured I would try to put at least one of these in here because they are kind of like the contemporary short horror of the internet, and it kind of deserves a place in any discussion about short horror literature. The Midnight Meat Train is a short story by Clive Barker that follows a police officer who moves to New York City but finds himself disillusioned with the city after finding out it isn't as great as he thought it would be. Things get even worse when he falls asleep on a subway train and runs into an underground organization that kills unsuspecting citizens and feeds them to kind of religious acolytes that worship a strange cultish group of people. There are some pretty nasty sections in this story. At one point, a character has his tongue forcibly removed and it's really gross and gruesome. This is a Clive Barker story, so that's kind of like what you signed up for going into it. This story was actually made into a movie that came out in 2008. I have never seen it and I've heard kind of mixed things about it. If you've seen it, then please let me know if it's worth watching. I'm definitely interested in it as I like the short story, but I'd be curious to see kind of how they expanded it to fit a full feature film runtime. Level 6. Autopilot is a Reddit story. I was really trying to avoid doing anything that came from Reddit because I feel like those stories are often classified as creepypastas, and I want to do a different video about those, but this one was particularly effective and not really a creepypasta. I recommend you give this a read. It's super quick, but it's definitely one of the more disturbing stories on the list, and there's a reason that it's down here. If you don't want to give it a read, then I'll explain it briefly here. Spoilers ahead. Before I read this though, this story deals with bad things happening to a child. That's kind of a spoiler, but I want to put this warning ahead because I don't want to catch any of you guys off guard and like have you guys be upset by what happens in this story. So if you don't like harm coming to children, then don't listen to this one. Autopilot is about a man who lives a completely normal life. He grabs his phone every day, drops his daughter off at daycare, and goes to work. He picks his daughter up, and the cycle repeats every single day. He's always on autopilot. One day, he wakes up to find his phone is almost dead, and he charges it on his counter and gets his daughter in the car and starts to drive. But he realizes that he forgot his phone on the counter and talks about how his autopilot disengages for a second. It's a hot day, but he drives to work without his phone and just works his normal shift. At this point, his autopilot has fully re-engaged. He's just going through the motions. So he goes back and he drives back to his house. The hot sun has caused a bad scent in his car, most likely from some takeout food that he had forgotten to throw away, but he doesn't look back. He doesn't want to worry about it. He drives home and is greeted by his wife who says, "Where's Emily?" He groans and realizes that he forgot to pick his daughter up from daycare, and he speeds back to the daycare facility and sees a note on the door that says, "Due to vandalism, please enter through the side door," and this breaks his autopilot. There was no note on the door in the morning, and he realizes that he can't remember going to the daycare that morning. His mind was on autopilot, and he just figured that he followed his normal routine. His autopilot disengages. He never dropped Emily off at daycare. She was still in the car when he got to work. She was sleeping. He didn't see her. It was a sweltering hot day. The foul smell in the car. Emily was left in the car all day. His phone was left on the counter. His daughter is dead. Autopilot disengaged. So yeah, pretty heartbreaking. This is a very real fear that a lot of people have. And this unfortunately happens like quite a few times in real life. I can't even imagine the horror of realizing that you left your child to die. It's probably one of the worst things that somebody could ever experience. People of Sand and Slag by Paolo Bacigalupi. I don't know how to say that. I think it's it sounds almost like it's an Italian last name. But anyway, it's a short science fiction story about a future society where humans have evolved to pretty much survive in any circumstance. They're almost kind of more like machines or cyborgs than humans. They a lot of them have like blades all over their bodies and other kind of weird augmentations. They're also able to pretty much eat anything and can live off eating like rocks and sands and all sorts of stuff that provides no nutritional value to us. They also seem to take pleasure in kind of cutting each other up, although it doesn't specify whether this hurts them or not. The story takes place far into the future where very little life is left on Earth, only these kind of bizarre evolved humans. No animals or anything that we would recognize today as being from this planet. So why is this story so far down on this list? It's because they find a dog. A crew finds this dog, just a normal dog like we would see today. They haven't seen a dog in thousands of years, and they debate what to do with it, and that is most of the story. And if you've watched some of my other videos and you know that animal violence really gets to me, and this story has a lot of that, and that's why it's really far down here. But if you have any sympathy towards dogs, this one will probably get to you. But it is a really good short story. I really enjoyed reading it. It's just that it has that element of like bad things happening to animals that I really don't like. Not even like a huge dog person, but that still always freaks me out. So again, really great short story, amazing work by the author. But if you're not interested in engaging with that, then this one's probably not for you. So one thing that I was worried about when I was making this video was finding short stories that were really all that disturbing. I found plenty of like amazing, wonderful horror stories and have several new favorites, but I wasn't finding anything that really grossed me out. And then I found this. Survivor Type by Stephen King is about a doctor that ends up stranded on a deserted island, and he writes in his journal and just sees just how far his will to live will take him. He is a pretty terrible person and he has no food with him, only medical supplies and heroin. That can't be good. I'm going to spoil this one in full, so if that sounds interesting to you, then give it a read. If you're particularly sensitive to things like amputations and animal torture, then this one probably isn't for you though. Spoilers ahead, and sorry if you're watching this, Mom. So our doctor is a really terrible person. He talks about all the patients that he did like unnecessary surgeries on and then gets them addicted to painkillers. He talks about a time in high school where he hired a friend to rip out the teeth of another kid that he didn't like. It's all very gross. But the doctor is stranded on this island and he doesn't have any food, so he decides to kill a seagull, and I couldn't stand this part. I've mentioned before, but I love birds and I live on the beach and I love seagulls, and so seeing this guy chase one down and essentially torture it before eating it raw was super gross. No sympathy there from me. The doctor ended up on the island after a cruise ship he was on blew up. He was transporting heroin, and that's mostly what is left with him on the island, that and his medical supplies, like I said. His right foot was injured in the blast, and he decides that he needs to amputate. He amputates his foot while high on the heroin. That's the only way he can get through the pain. But the issue is that catching the seagulls seems to be a very difficult task for him, especially now that he only has one foot, and it would be pretty foolish to let good food go to waste. Probably best not to let the amputated foot go to waste. The doctor hobbles around painfully on his stump and realizes that he's even more helpless than he was before. He is constantly taking drugs and is losing what is left of his mind. He tries to eat some seaweed, but it isn't filling, and he decides to amputate his other foot. He is drooling while he does this, and he just tells himself to think of cold roast beef. The foot isn't wasted. The rest of the story sees the doctor amputating more and more of his legs. Anytime he gets hungry, he amputates just a little bit more. At this point, he crawls around like some sort of stoned flesh crab. He looks at his reflection in the water and laughs at his ghoulish appearance. He cut off his earlobes and ate them the day before. The story ends with there being nothing left to cut. Throughout the story, the doctor has emphasized just how much he takes care of his hands. He played football in high school, but always wrapped his hands because it was always his dream to be a surgeon. When he made it to the island, he was thrilled that his hands weren't damaged at all. But now with the hunger in his stomach, he looks at his precious hands. And he says, "Good food, good meat." He says they taste just like lady fingers. This story seriously grossed me out. It reminded me a lot of The Troop by Nick Cutter. I have a full video about that book if you're interested. This short story was honestly grosser than that book ever got. Amputation always gets to me, but adding cannibalism just makes it worse. And that's going to do it for specific horror stories, but I did want to shout out Clive Barker's Books of Blood. It's a series of 6 horror anthologies that have tons of horrifying stories in them that range from like pretty eerie to really messed up. That's where the In the Hills, the Cities story and the Midnight Meat Train story came from. So I'm interested in buying those books and reading them. I wanted to tease a future video in this video, so I'm going to do that now. I've ordered this series and I'm planning on making a big video that goes over all the stories in that series, kind of like I did with the Battle of the Red Hot Pepperoonies video that I just made. Another reason that I'm not filling out this last section of the Iceberg as much is that I'm having a hard time finding anything that is like readily available that is truly depraved. So I will challenge you guys to find some depraved short horror stories that are worse than the cannibalism one that I just finished on. If you guys can come up with a good amount of stuff that makes my stomach churn, then I will for sure make another video just covering the absolute worst of the worst. I look forward to seeing what you guys can come up with. If you've written something yourself, then I'd love to read that as well. I've had a couple authors reach out to me over email and have sent me copies of their books, and I've really enjoyed that. I'm working my way through Bruised and Bemused through an author that I'm sorry I can't remember your name. Please put your name in the comments below. I'm really enjoying that book so far. So again, if you're somebody who watches these videos and you write stuff and you want to send me your horrifying, depraved story, please go ahead. I'd love to read it. The short story is a literary medium that is just so important, and I had a blast reading all of these. And I found some of my new favorite pieces of literature, like period. I absolutely loved The Summer People by Shirley Jackson, and The Box Social is another one of my new favorites. Thank you guys so much for recommending a lot of these. Sorry if I didn't get to your specific short story that you wanted. I kind of filled up the first few layers, then I had to kind of scrounge around for some of the stuff that was truly depraved. I would love to make another part in this series if this video does pretty well. The Kids Horror Iceberg is doing really well right now, and I've started the script for the second part of that video series. I'm also working my way through the fourth part of the Disturbing Books Iceberg, but you guys can tell my voice is kind of getting a little hoarse. It's 11:30 at night, and I have to work tomorrow, and so I need to get to bed kind of soon here. Thank you guys so much for your support in all my videos, especially those of you that watch the videos that are unrelated to the Iceberg content. I love making these Iceberg videos. I think they're so fun. I love getting to read so many things, but I have a ton of fun with the other content that doesn't perform quite as well. If you're somebody who has found my channel through this video or just mostly watches the Iceberg videos, I would really encourage you to watch my videos that I've made on Pen Pal, Ring, the one on Mike Flanagan's really fun, and especially the Battle of the Red Hot Pepper Weenies. That one was called like The Disturbing Short Stories Hidden in Your Elementary School Library, something like that. It's my most recent video before this one, and it's actually uses a very similar format to these Iceberg videos. So if you like the in-depth explanations of a bunch of kind of like random creepy stories you've never heard of, then you'll love that video. It's very similar to this one. Please remember to subscribe if you haven't yet. I'm coming up on 10,000 subs, which is absolutely insane. I started this year with the goal of hitting 1,000 subs by the end of April, and I was honestly not sure I could actually do it. My growth was like pretty consistent but pretty slow for like the past 8 months, but I'm just so grateful that you guys proved me wrong on that. If you want to support the channel further, then please consider becoming a channel member, where you will have access to exclusive videos about my own personal favorite books and some other content about my favorite music. I'm making a video about that that'll be really fun, and just how I make my videos as well. You can become a channel member for only $3 a month, and you'll get early access to all my videos as well as your name in the credits of my videos like you're seeing right now. The channel member videos are kind of stuff that I'm interested in talking about, but stuff that I know kind of isn't in my specific niche for my channel. And I try really hard to stay in my specific niche because that just helps with my reach on YouTube, and it helps with kind of maintaining a consistent view flow. I'm trying to kind of do that so I can help grow this channel a little bit more. But definitely if I ever like have a whole bunch of subscribers, I'd love to like force you guys to listen to me talking about music, because I'm a huge music person. A huge thank you to all my gold tier members, those being Amanda Mapes, Saddest John, Lucas Fernando, Chris Lamb, Silent Trails, Blue Radio Media, Ezra, and Coco Boko. You guys are seriously the best, and I'm just so happy and thankful for your support. Again, it's crazy to think that anybody like wants to be a channel member. I kind of just put that out there originally just as not like a goof, but I was just kind of like, oh, nobody will do this. And I'm super glad you guys are joining. I hope you're enjoying the exclusive content. I'm loving making it, and there's going to be a lot more of it in the future. But that is going to do it for this video. Again, my voice is almost completely gone at this point. Thank you again to everybody for watching me talk about weird, scary, disturbing books and stories, and I'll catch you in the next one. See ya.